The sounds we hear in the dark are supposed to be the wind. The shapes we see are supposed to be shadows, but sometimes they are not. Sometimes the past isn't dead, it's just waiting underground, in the static, in the empty rooms where the lights still burn. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously. The collapsed shaft. Frank Miller believed in geology, in the unyielding physics of rock and pressure that governed his world. As a mine safety inspector for MSHA in West Virginia, his entire career was built on predictable stresses and measurable decay, a gospel written in strata and support timbers. The Blackwood No. 3 mine, abandoned since a catastrophic methane explosion in 1954, was just another entry in his logbook, a final survey before its permanent concrete seal. The official MSHA inspection log for April of 1994 would eventually tell a sanitized version of this story, but the truth began in the deep, cold silence 1,000 feet below the Green Hills. The air at the mine's mouth was thick with the scent of wet stone and decay, a familiar perfume of forgotten industry. Frank's headlamp cut a solitary dancing circle against the damp, glistening rock, his steel-toed boots crunching on the gravel and debris of the main drift. The deeper he went, the more the world outside ceased to exist, replaced by the rhythmic drip of water and the profound, almost liquid quality of the darkness that pressed in from all sides. His job was methodical, almost ritualistic. He checked the integrity of the remaining timbers, their wood long petrified by mineral-rich water. He noted the stress fractures in the coal seams, the slow, inevitable creep of the mountain reclaiming its territory. Everything was exactly as the 40-year-old maps indicated, a tomb of industry locked in time. It was near the end of the accessible tunnel, at a section clearly marked as Section G, Full Collapse 1954, that he first heard it. He had switched off his headlamp to let his eyes adjust, a small trick to spot faint gas seepages. In the absolute, perfect blackness, a sound began. It was rhythmic, structured, and entirely impossible. A dull, metallic thump, followed by the scraping crunch of rock. Thump, scrape, chunk. Frank froze, every muscle tensed. His rational mind immediately searched for an explanation. It had to be a rockfall, a settling of the deep earth. Natural reverberations in abandoned mines could mimic human activity. He knew that. He had written reports on it. But this was different. The sound had a cadence, a deliberate rhythm that spoke of effort, of intention. It sounded, to his experienced ear, exactly like a man swinging a pickaxe. He turned his lamp back on, the beam spearing the darkness and revealing nothing but the immense wall of shattered rock and coal that sealed Section G. The sound continued, steady and unwavering, seemingly coming from deep within the tons of collapsed earth. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp rock face. The vibration was faint but undeniable. A chill, entirely unrelated to the mine's subterranean cold, crept up his spine. He spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize it, trying to fit the sound into the neat boxes of his geological knowledge. But the rhythm haunted him. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of the pickaxe echoed in the quiet of his motel room. The following day, he returned to the mine, this time with a sensitive audio recorder, the kind used to detect minute seismic shifts. He secured the magnetic microphone to the rock face of the collapse and let the machine run for 6 hours. Back in his truck, playing the audio through his headphones, the sound was terrifyingly clear. It was not just a pickaxe. Beneath the rhythmic striking, there were other noises: the grating squeal of a rusted minecart wheel, and, fainter still, the unmistakable cadence of a human voice, too muffled to be understood but undeniably there. The MSHA log shows Frank requisitioned a small exploratory drilling team, citing concerns of unexpected geological pressures behind the Section G collapse. It was a lie, a piece of bureaucratic fiction to justify an action he couldn't logically defend. His crew, two grizzled miners named Henderson and Clark, thought he was being overly cautious. They set up their rig, the modern whining sound of their drill, a stark contrast to the archaic noises on Frank's tape. The moment their drill bit touched the rock face, the sounds from within stopped. Not faded, not tapered off, they just ceased. An abrupt, deafening silence fell over the mine, a silence that felt heavier and more menacing than before. Henderson and Clark exchanged uneasy glances. They drilled a 3-inch borehole 20 feet into the collapse, then fed a fiber optic camera through. Frank watched the monitor, his heart pounding against his ribs. The screen showed a grainy, monochromatic world of tightly packed shale, coal, and shattered rock. There were no voids, no pockets, no space for a man to stand, let alone work. It was exactly what the old map said it should be: a solid, impenetrable wall of debris. The official explanation was that their drilling had relieved some pocket of trapped gas or water, silencing whatever natural process was causing the noise. Frank knew it was a hollow theory. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had been heard, that their intrusion had been noted by something inside. Driven by a fear he refused to name, he made a decision that went far beyond any MSHA protocol. He called in heavy excavation equipment. He told the regional office that the borehole camera had shown signs of a dangerously large, unstable cavern, a potential sinkhole risk to the surface above. The lie grew, but it was the only way. For 2 weeks, the machinery clawed at the mountain, removing the 1954 collapse piece by piece. Frank oversaw the operation, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach with every truckload of rock that was hauled away. When they finally broke through into the old tunnel of Section G, the air that rushed out was stale and dead, the smell of a crypt sealed for generations. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dust-filled darkness. The tunnel was just as the grainy photos from the 1950s had shown. A rusted minecart lay on its side, its wheels seized. A scattering of hand tools, including several pickaxes, lay where they had been dropped, coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust and grime. Timber supports, shattered by the initial explosion, were frozen in their moment of collapse. There was no one there. There was no sign of any activity in 40 years. The dust on the floor was a perfect, unbroken blanket. Frank walked the length of the short, dead-end tunnel, the silence now absolute. He ran a gloved hand over a rusted pickaxe lying near the far wall. The layer of dust was so thick it came away like fur. There was no logical explanation. The sounds had been real, recorded, and verified, yet the source was impossible. The crew, unnerved and silent, began the work of permanently sealing the tunnel, this time with thousands of pounds of steel and concrete. They worked quickly, eager to be out of that place. Frank took the audio recorder, the one with the impossible sounds, and buried it deep in the woods, miles away from the mine. He couldn't bring himself to destroy it, but he couldn't bear to listen to it again. The MSHA log for April 1994 states that the Blackwood No. 3 mine was inspected, found to have minor instabilities in Section G which were rectified, and then permanently sealed according to federal regulations. It is a clean, professional report. It makes no mention of the sounds. It makes no mention of the pickaxe that swung in the dark, of the voices that whispered from within the rock. Frank Miller retired a few years later, a man haunted by a sound that geology could not explain. Long after he left the mountains of West Virginia, he would wake in the dead of night, his heart racing, to the phantom echo of a pickaxe striking coal, a lonely, desperate rhythm from a place that should have been silent forever. He never returned to Blackwood Mountain, knowing that some tombs are meant to remain sealed, not because of what they hold, but because of what they might let out. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was a listening silence, a patient silence, waiting for the day someone might come digging again. The radio holler sheriff's deputy Ben Carter knew the hollows of eastern Kentucky like the back of his hand. He understood their moods, the way fog clung to the creek beds in the morning, the way the ancient hills seemed to breathe around him on a quiet night. His world was one of tangible problems, domestic disputes, illegal stills, the occasional desperate soul lost in the kudzu-choked woods. It was a world of static and squelch on the county radio, of voices cutting through the mountains with news of ordinary trouble. Until one night in July of 2008, when a voice from the past bled through the airwaves and led him into a place where time had come undone. The call came in just after 2 a.m., a ghost on the frequency. It wasn't the clean, clipped transmission of a modern radio. It was faint, riddled with static, like an old AM station struggling to find its signal. Dispatch couldn't make it out at first, but Ben, parked on a ridge overlooking the valley, heard it with a chilling clarity. A man's voice, panicked and breathless, layered under decades of electronic noise. "Mayday, mayday," the voice crackled, thin and distant. "This is Miller's Holler, the tunnel. It's gone. Oh God, it's all gone. Can anyone hear me?" Ben keyed his mic. "Dispatch, you getting this? Sounds like a distress call." The dispatcher, a young woman named Sarah, came back, her voice tinged with confusion. "We hear something, Ben, but it's just noise on our end. No signal lock, no caller ID. It's like it's coming from everywhere and nowhere at once." The voice on the radio spoke again, more desperate now. "The water's rising. We're trapped down here. My name is John Miller. Please, someone." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the transmission dissolved into a hiss of static. Ben felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Miller's Holler. He knew that name. It wasn't on any modern map. It was a ghost place, a former mining settlement abandoned in the 70s after the company went bust, and a flash flood wiped out the main access road. The county sheriff's radio archive from July 2008 contains the official log of this event. It notes a phantom transmission and Deputy Carter's subsequent investigation. But the dry text of the log cannot capture the profound unease that settled over the valley that night. Ben's first instinct was to dismiss it. He knew that radio repeaters in the deep valleys could sometimes catch and loop old transmissions, atmospheric flukes that bounced signals across time. It was a known phenomenon, a rational explanation. But the name, John Miller, stuck with him. He drove back to the station, the silence in his patrol car feeling heavy and watchful. He spent the next hour digging through the county archives, the smell of old paper and dust filling the small room. He found what he was looking for in a box of records from the old Miller Coal Company, a faded employee ledger from 1972. And there it was, John Miller, foreman. A second file, a yellowed newspaper clipping, told the rest of the story. On a stormy night in November of 1972, a section of the Miller mine had collapsed during a flash flood. 6 miners were lost. The recovery effort was eventually called off, the mine deemed too unstable. The bodies were never recovered. One of the missing men was the foreman, John Miller. The company folded a year later, and the families moved away, leaving Miller's Holler to be reclaimed by the forest. The rational explanation began to feel thin, stretched to its breaking point. A radio echo was one thing, a radio echo that named a specific man who died in a specific place. A place now calling for help, nearly 40 years later, was something else entirely. Against the sheriff's advice, Ben decided to drive out to the old holler. The access road was barely a trail now, a washed-out ribbon of dirt and rock that scraped the undercarriage of his SUV. Kudzu draped the trees like green funeral shrouds, and the air grew thick and still as he descended into the valley. He parked where the road disappeared completely and continued on foot, pushing through a dense wall of undergrowth. After a half hour of struggling through the humid forest, he found them. The foundations. A few crumbling brick chimneys stood like lonely gravestones choked with vines. The rusted husks of old cars were slowly sinking back into the earth. This was Miller's Holler. A profound sense of desolation hung over the place. It was unnaturally quiet. No birds sang. No insects chirped. There was only the sound of his own breathing and the soft rustle of leaves under his boots. He found the entrance to the mine, a dark, gaping wound in the hillside, boarded up with heavy, rotting timbers. A faded, peeling sign warned, "Danger, unsafe, no entry." The air flowing out of it was cold and smelled of wet, dead earth. He pulled out his radio, the logical part of his brain needing to test the theory. "Dispatch, this is Carter. Do you copy?" Only static answered. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Nothing. The deep valley walls blocked all signals. It was a complete dead zone. So how had a distress call from this exact spot reached his radio on the ridge? The question hung in the oppressive silence, unanswered. He spent another hour exploring the ruins, a growing sense of being watched prickling the back of his neck. He found nothing but decay and memory. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, he made his way back to his vehicle. The feeling of dread didn't leave him until he had crested the ridge and was back on the main highway. The familiar lights of civilization a welcome sight. Back at the station, he tried to file a report, but the words felt inadequate, insane. He logged it as an unidentified radio malfunction and left it at that. For the rest of the night, the radio was silent, filled only with the usual chatter of a rural county at night. The voice of John Miller did not return. The next day, Ben took the archived recording of the phantom transmission to a sound engineer in the next town. The engineer spent hours cleaning the audio, filtering out the layers of static. What he found was chilling. Behind the main voice, behind John Miller's desperate pleas, there were other sounds. The distinct, terrifying sound of rushing water, the groan of collapsing earth, and something else. The faint, panicked shouts of other men, their voices woven into the fabric of the static like echoes in a tomb. The radio signal from Miller's Holler was never heard again. It was a one-time event, a brief, impossible cry for help that had sliced through 40 years of silence. Ben Carter continued to patrol the hollows of eastern Kentucky, but something had changed. He no longer saw them as just hills and trees. He saw them as places that held memories, places that sometimes, on a quiet night, could whisper their tragedies into the air. He avoided the road to Miller's Holler, never returning to the place where the silence felt so much like a held breath. The official record remains a radio anomaly, but Ben knew he had heard a ghost, a moment of terror and loss preserved in the ether, still trapped in the cold, dark earth of that forgotten valley, forever calling for a rescue that would never come. The school gym lights. Arthur Penhaligon was a man who appreciated the quiet order of things. For 30 years, he had been a janitor for the county, a silent custodian of empty hallways and silent classrooms. His life was measured in the scent of floor wax and the rhythmic hum of his buffer. In the winter of 1997, his assignment was the recently closed Northwood High School in rural Virginia, a sprawling brick building slated for demolition. His job was simple: keep the pipes from freezing and the vandals from breaking in until the wrecking ball arrived. The school was a husk, its life and energy drained away. The lockers stood open and empty. The classrooms were filled with dusty, stacked desks, and profound silence had settled over the building. The kind of quiet that only comes to a place once filled with noise. Arthur liked the silence. It was predictable. The county maintenance work order from February of that year is a sparse document, noting only electrical system decommissioning and custodial oversight. It does not mention the lights in the gymnasium. It was on a Tuesday night, during a routine patrol, that Arthur first saw it. He was walking the second-floor corridor that overlooked the gym. Below him, through the large interior windows, the vast, empty space was bathed in a brilliant, unwavering light. The massive industrial floodlights, the ones used for basketball games, were on. All of them. Arthur stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion. This was impossible. He knew for a fact that the main power to the school had been cut weeks ago. He had been there when the utility crew had physically disconnected the service line from the pole outside. The only electricity in the entire building came from a small gas-powered generator he used for his vacuum and a single work lamp in his closet. He walked down the stairs, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silent building. He pushed open the heavy double doors to the gym. The light was almost blinding, a stark white glare that erased all shadows. It was humming, a low electric thrum that vibrated in his chest. He could feel the heat coming off the bulbs. He walked to the center of the polished wood floor, his reflection a dark, solitary figure in the glossy surface. He stared up at the lights, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was a backup system he didn't know about, some emergency battery pack. He made his way to the breaker room adjacent to the gym. The panel was cold and dead. He flipped every switch, but nothing happened. He could see the main conduit, thick as his arm, where the power lines had been severed with industrial cutters, their copper ends taped and inert. There was no connection. There was no power source. Yet the lights burned. A deep, primal unease began to creep into Arthur's quiet, orderly world. He backed out of the gym, pulling the heavy doors shut, and the sliver of brilliant light beneath them vanished. He didn't sleep well that night. The image of the silent, impossibly lit gymnasium was burned into his mind. The next day, he called the county maintenance department. The foreman, a man named Gary, laughed it off. Probably just some residual charge in the old capacitors, Art. Happens sometimes. Gives off a phantom flicker. But what Arthur had seen wasn't a flicker. It was a steady, powerful, consuming light. The phenomenon continued. Every few nights, he would find the gym ablaze with light. It was never on when he arrived, but at some point during his shift, it would ignite. He never saw it switch on. It was either off or on, with no transition. he started to notice other things. A faint, rhythmic echo, like the dribbling of a basketball, that would sometimes drift down the empty hallways. He would trace the sound to the gym doors, but when he opened them, there was only the silent, brilliant light and the empty court. Neighbors living in the houses across the field began to call the sheriff's department, reporting lights and strange noises coming from the closed school. The patrol cars would arrive, their flashing blue and red lights painting the school's brick facade. But by the time they got there, the gymnasium was always dark and silent. Arthur was now the crazy old janitor who was seeing things. His reputation, built on decades of reliability, was beginning to fray. He became obsessed. He wanted proof. He brought a video camera to work, setting it up on a tripod in the second-floor hallway, aimed at the gym windows. He let it record all night. When he watched the tape the next morning, his blood ran cold. The video showed the dark hallway for hours. Then, in an instant, without a flicker, the windows to the gym below erupted in brilliant white light. A few minutes later, the audio picked up a faint but unmistakable sound. The rhythmic squeak of sneakers on a polished floor, the thud of a bouncing ball, even what sounded like the distant murmur of a crowd. But the gym, visible through the windows, was completely, utterly empty. He showed the tape to Gary, the maintenance foreman. Gary watched it, his face pale, the dismissive smile gone. He agreed to bring in an electrical engineer. The engineer, a young, no-nonsense woman with a briefcase full of diagnostic tools, spent an entire day at the school. She traced every wire, every conduit. Her final report was simple and direct. The floodlight system was physically and completely disconnected from any and all power sources, active or latent. The bulbs were wired to nothing. She had no explanation for how they could be turning on. She suggested, in a hesitant, unofficial capacity, that perhaps they should remove the bulbs. That night, Arthur and Gary, armed with a tall ladder, entered the humming, brightly lit gym. The air was thick with a strange, static energy. As Gary climbed the ladder to unscrew the first massive bulb, the rhythmic dribbling sound started, loud and clear, seemingly right beside them on the court. They both froze, staring at the empty space. Then, all at once, the lights went out, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. A collective sighing sound echoed through the vast space, and then silence. They scrambled out of the gym, fumbling with flashlights, their hearts hammering in their chests. Arthur Penhaligon broke his contract the next day. He packed his things and left the keys on the desk, refusing to ever set foot in Northwood High School again. The county eventually hired a private security firm to watch the property. Their reports from the final weeks before demolition are filled with strange notes. Motion sensors tripping in the empty gymnasium, guards hearing the sounds of a game being played in the dead of night. The school was torn down that summer, the gymnasium reduced to a pile of brick and twisted steel. But some stories linger. People in the town still talk about it, about the old high school that refused to die, that held onto the echoes of its past so tightly that it could still find a way to turn on the lights for one last game, drawing power from nothing but memory itself. The switchback convoy. For a long-haul trucker like Dave Paskins, the Blue Ridge Parkway at night was a special kind of church. It was a place of deep solitude, a winding asphalt ribbon draped over the sleeping spine of the Appalachian Mountains. He'd been driving this route for 15 years, and he knew every curve, every scenic overlook, every place where the fog lay thickest in the hollows. His truck was his world, a self-contained universe of diesel fumes, country radio, and the steady, hypnotic rhythm of the road. But on a cold, moonless night in October of 2011, the familiar solitude of the parkway was broken by a silent, impossible convoy that would haunt the rest of his driving days. The Department of Transportation Patrol report from that night is clinical and brief. It logs a single 18-wheeler, driven by David Paskins, on the northbound stretch near milepost 86. It makes a small note of heavy, localized fog, but concludes with no incidents reported. The official record, as is so often the case, tells none of the story. Dave was grinding his way up a long, steep grade, a series of punishing switchbacks that climbed toward the apple orchard mountain overlook. The air was crisp and cold, and the stars were brilliant in the gaps between the ancient, stooped trees. It was around 3 a.m., that dead hour when the world seems to hold its breath. That's when he saw the headlights in his rearview mirror. It wasn't unusual to see other trucks, even at this hour. He registered them subconsciously at first. 3 distinct sets of high beams, spaced out evenly, pulling the same grade he was. He felt a small, fleeting sense of camaraderie, a silent acknowledgement of other souls working through the lonely night. He watched them in his mirror as he navigated the tight, winding curves. They were big rigs, just like his, their lights cutting powerful cones through the darkness. They kept a steady distance, never getting closer, never falling behind. They were just there, a silent escort climbing the mountain behind him. As he neared the crest of the ridge, a thick bank of fog rolled in, a common occurrence at that elevation. The world outside his cab dissolved into a swirling, opaque whiteness. His visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. He slowed down, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes straining to follow the white line on the road's edge. The headlights behind him were still there, diffused by the fog into 3 glowing, ethereal orbs. They were a comforting presence in the disorienting mist. He reached the summit, the road leveling out, and as he began his descent, he broke through the fog bank as suddenly as he had entered it. The sky opened up again, clear and studded with stars. The air was sharp and clean. He drove for another minute, his eyes occasionally flicking to his rearview mirror, expecting to see the 3 trucks emerge from the fog behind him. But they never did. The road behind him was empty, black. He frowned. That was odd. They should have been right on his tail. He checked his side mirrors. Nothing. Just the dark, empty road winding back into the fog-shrouded peak. His trucker's mind started running through the possibilities. Maybe they had pulled over at the overlook just before the summit. But all 3 of them, at the same time, without a signal? It didn't feel right. There were no other exits, no turnoffs on that stretch of the parkway. It was a solid, unbroken line of asphalt. Where could 3 full-sized 18-wheelers have gone? A prickle of unease ran down his spine. The solitude of the road suddenly felt less like peace and more like a profound and unsettling isolation. He grabbed his CB radio, the crackle and hiss a familiar sound in the quiet cab. Hey, northbound 18-wheelers, you got your ears on? Saw you coming up the grade behind me. You guys pull over at the top, static. He tried again. Any drivers on the parkway tonight? Give me a shout back. The radio remained stubbornly silent. It was as if he were the only person on the entire mountain range. He drove the rest of his route with a knot of anxiety in his chest, constantly checking his mirrors, half expecting to see the 3 phantom headlights reappear. They never did. When he pulled into a truck stop for breakfast just after dawn, he felt an overwhelming need for confirmation. He checked his dashcam footage. The small, forward-facing camera wouldn't show what was behind him, but it would confirm the conditions. He rewound the tape. There was the clear night, the climb, and then the sudden, thick wall of fog. As he watched, he noticed something he hadn't seen in the moment. Just as his truck entered the fog, the reflection in a roadside sign showed it clearly. His own headlights, and behind them, 3 more pairs of bright, distinct lights, following him into the white abyss. The camera showed him driving through the fog for several minutes and then emerging into the clear air on the other side. The road ahead was empty. He fast-forwarded through the rest of his descent. No trucks ever passed him. They had entered the fog, but they had not come out. Later that day, he called a friend who worked for the state DOT. He asked him, casually, to check the traffic logs for the parkway from the previous night. The friend called him back an hour later. The report was unequivocal. Apart from Dave's own truck, which was tracked by its transponder, there were no other vehicles, commercial or otherwise, registered on that section of the Blue Ridge Parkway between midnight and 6 a.m. No skid marks were ever found. No signs of an accident. No reports of missing drivers. The 3 trucks had simply vanished. Dave Paskins still drives that route, but he no longer finds peace in the nighttime solitude of the mountains. He drives a little faster now, especially on the foggy stretches. He avoids looking in his rearview mirror when he's climbing the switchbacks toward Apple Orchard Mountain. He knows the logical explanation that fog and blind curves can play tricks on the eyes, creating illusions of disappearing vehicles. But he also knows what he saw. He saw the reflections on the sign. He saw the 3 sets of lights that followed him into the mist and were consumed by it. He can't shake the feeling that some roads don't just lead to other places. Some roads, on a dark night, high in the old mountains, led to nowhere at all. The flooded cellar. In March of 1983, the rains came to western North Carolina and didn't stop for a week. The rivers swelled, the creeks overflowed their banks, and the rich, red soil became a sodden sponge. For volunteer firefighters like Samuel Jones, it was a week of sleepless nights, filled with calls to pump out flooded basements and clear fallen trees from rural roads. Sam was a practical man, a carpenter by trade, and he understood the simple, brutal mechanics of water. Water found the lowest point. It exploited weaknesses. It was relentless, but it was predictable. The call that changed his mind came from a remote farmhouse, an old 2-story clapboard structure owned by an elderly widow named Alara Vance. Her cellar was flooded, she'd said, the water coming up through the floor. It was a routine call, one of a dozen they'd had that day. The county fire service log from that week is thick with similar entries, a testament to the storm's fury. This one, however, is marked with a handwritten addendum by the fire chief. S. Jones reports anomalous activity. Recommend follow-up by county engineer. Site sealed. The house stood alone in a field of wet, brown grass, looking tired and ancient. Mrs. Vance met them on the porch, a frail woman with eyes that held a deep, watery fear. "It's not the rain," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the house. It's drinking." Sam gave her a reassuring smile and led his small crew, a couple of young volunteers, to the cellar door at the back of the house. When he opened it, the smell that rolled out was not the usual scent of damp earth and mildew. It was the cold, briny smell of a deep lake, of stagnant, ancient water. The cellar was full, the dark, murky water lapping just a few inches below the floor joists of the house above. They set up their portable pump, dropped the intake hose into the water, and fired up the engine. For the next 3 hours, the pump roared, spewing a thick, brown torrent of water out into the yard. Slowly, the water level dropped, revealing the stone walls of the cellar, slick with algae and a floor of packed earth. When the last of the water was gone, Sam waded in with a flashlight. The source of the flooding was immediately obvious, or so he thought. A natural spring had clearly opened up in the center of the floor, a common occurrence in the region's limestone-rich terrain. Water was still bubbling up, albeit slowly. "Well, there's your problem, ma'am," he called up to Mrs. Vance. "You've got a new spring under your house. You'll need to get a sump pump installed, maybe have a contractor put in a drain." Mrs. Vance shook her head, her face pale. "It's not a spring. It won't stop." They packed up their equipment and left, advising her to call a plumber. Sam felt a pang of sympathy for the old woman, but it was a straightforward problem with a straightforward solution. He thought nothing more of it until the call came again the next morning. It was Mrs. Vance, her voice strained with panic. "It's full again, all the way to the top." Sam drove out alone this time, a sense of disbelief warring with a growing unease. He opened the cellar door, and his stomach dropped. It was true. The cellar was completely full again, the dark water still and silent. It was impossible. The small spring he'd seen couldn't have produced that much water overnight. There had to be a broken water main, a hidden pipe connection. He called the county water department. An engineer met him at the farmhouse. Together, they spent the day searching for a source. They shut off the main water line to the house. They used listening devices to check for underground leaks. They found nothing. There were no pipes, active or abandoned, running anywhere near the cellar. The house was completely isolated from the county water system. Puzzled and frustrated, the engineer agreed to have the fire department pump the cellar out one more time for a better look. As the water level receded again, Sam noticed something he hadn't seen the day before. Objects were floating in the water. An old wooden crate, a glass jar, a child's leather shoe. But they weren't just floating. They were moving, slowly swirling in a counterclockwise direction, as if being stirred by an unseen hand in the center of the room where the water was deepest. When the cellar was empty, the spring was still there, a gentle bubbling in the mud. But the movement of the objects had been too organized, too deliberate for such a small upwelling. The engineer, a man of science and blueprints, was visibly unsettled. "This makes no sense," he muttered, shaking his head. "There's no hydrostatic pressure that could account for this refill rate." That night, a profound sense of dread kept Sam awake. He thought of Mrs. Vance's words, "It's the house. It's drinking." The next morning, he returned to the farmhouse. He found Mrs. Vance sitting in her kitchen, staring at the floor. She told him that she had heard sounds from the cellar all night, a soft lapping noise, like a thirsty animal. The water was back, full again. This time, they didn't pump it. The engineer, at a complete loss, recommended the only solution he could think of. They would seal the basement. A construction crew was brought in. They filled the entire cellar with gravel and then poured a thick slab of concrete over it, entombing the mysterious spring forever. The cellar door was boarded up and locked. The problem, officially, was solved. Sam visited Mrs. Vance a week later to check on her. The house was quiet. The lapping sounds from below had stopped, but Mrs. Vance seemed more terrified than ever. "It's not gone," she told him, her eyes wide. "It's just quiet. It's waiting. I can feel the house is heavier now. It's full." The official county record attributes the incident to a geologically unstable artesian well. But Sam Jones knew he had witnessed something that defied geology. He had stood at the edge of a place that was connected to a source of water that did not belong to the rational world. He had seen the slow, deliberate stir of the water and felt the unnatural cold that clung to the stone walls. Years later, after Mrs. Vance passed away and the old farmhouse was torn down, the demolition crew reported a strange discovery. The thick concrete slab they had poured in the cellar was fractured, broken from below by some immense, constant pressure, and beneath it the space was not filled with gravel, but with a dark, still, silent pool of water. The source of the water was never found. It seemed to come from the earth itself, a thirsty presence that had been momentarily denied, but was now free to drink its fill again in the ruins of the old house. The ridgeline Markham Hayes considered himself a steward of the wild. As a park ranger at Shenandoah National Park, his duties were a blend of conservation, law enforcement, and quiet observation. He knew the rhythms of the park, the seasonal migration of deer, the bloom times of the mountain laurel, the patterns of the tourists who flooded the trails on summer weekends. His world was governed by the predictable cycles of nature and the Park Service regulations designed to protect it. But in the spring of 2016, a series of inexplicable sightings on the high ridges began to unravel his understanding of the wilderness he thought he knew so well. The National Park Service Patrol observation log from May of that year contains a series of entries by Ranger Hayes, each one more perplexed than the last. They begin simply enough. May 7th, 21:30 hours. Observed what appeared to be two hikers on Stony Man Trail, post-closure. Searched area, found no one. No vehicle at trailhead. The park closed at sunset. It was a strict rule. The trails were treacherous in the dark, and the wildlife needed its space. Markham had been at a scenic overlook, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the Blue Ridge, when he saw them. Two silhouettes, clear as day, walking along the spine of the opposite ridge against the deep purple of the twilight sky. They were moving at a steady pace, not using flashlights, which was strange and dangerous. He'd jumped in his truck and driven to the trailhead, expecting to find a car and issue a warning or a fine. But the parking lot was empty. The trail was silent. He hiked a half-mile in, calling out, his voice swallowed by the immense quiet of the forest. He found no tracks, no sign of passage. He chalked it up to a trick of the light, perhaps two deer moving in a way that mimicked human forms. It happened. Thermal and night vision gear, which he often used, was notorious for misreading animal heat signatures as human, especially at a distance. But it happened again the next weekend. This time, he was prepared. He had a high-powered spotting scope set up at the same overlook. As dusk settled, the figures appeared. This time, 3 of them. They walked the exact same path along the ridgeline, their movements fluid and unhurried. Through the scope, they were just dark shapes, lacking any discernible features, like cutouts pasted against the fading light. And then, as they reached a specific point on the trail, a spot marked by a distinctive gnarled old oak tree, they simply dissolved. They didn't walk behind the tree or dip into a low spot. One by one, they faded into the evening mist, vanishing completely. A cold dread, foreign and unwelcome, washed over Markham. This was not normal. He began a quiet, unofficial investigation. He spent his days off in the local historical archives, digging into the history of that particular section of the park. He learned that the land had been home to families for generations before the park was established in the 1930s. Many of them had been forced to leave, a painful and bitter chapter in the park's history. The ridgeline the figures walked had once been the path between two family homesteads, the Browns and the Sullivans. He found old, faded photographs of the families, their faces stern and proud, standing in front of log cabins that had long since rotted back into the earth. The following weekend, he installed a state-of-the-art, motion-activated night vision camera on a tree opposite the ridgeline path. He aimed it directly at the spot near the old oak where the figures always disappeared. He left it there for a week, his anticipation mixed with a growing sense of trepidation. When he retrieved the memory card and played the footage, the hair on his arms stood on end. The camera had recorded them. Every night, just after sunset, they appeared. The footage was grainy, the figures glowing a soft, ethereal white in the infrared. They walked the same path, their pace unvarying. They wore what looked like old-fashioned clothing, long dresses on the women, overalls on the men. They moved without a sound, and every single time, as they reached the gnarled oak, they would turn their heads in unison, as if looking directly at the hidden camera, before fading into nothing. The camera recorded no heat signatures, no sound, just the silent, ghostly procession. The footage was terrifying, but it was also melancholic. They weren't menacing. They seemed lost, trapped in a loop, endlessly walking a path that no longer connected to a home. They were a memory imprinted on the landscape, a psychic scar from a time of displacement and loss. Markham felt a profound shift in his perception of the park. It was not just a collection of trees and rocks. It was a place that held history, a place that remembered. The cycles he was used to observing were not just ecological, but something deeper, more spectral. He showed the footage to his supervisor, a hardened veteran of the Park Service. The man watched the silent, ghostly figures walk their lonely path and fade away. He stared at the screen for a long time after the video ended, his face grim. "Delete it," he said, his voice low. "We're not opening that can of worms. Officially, this is a recurring thermal anomaly caused by venting from a rock fissure. That's what the report will say." And that's what it said. The official logbook concludes with a note about thermal inversions creating visual artifacts. The camera was removed. The incident was officially closed. Markham Hayes still works at Shenandoah. He still patrols the trails and watches the sun set over the ancient mountains. But he no longer looks for unauthorized hikers on the high ridges after dark. He knows who is walking there. He understands that some residents of the park never left, and that their quiet, sad journey is a part of the land itself. Sometimes, on a clear evening, he will stand at the overlook and watch the ridgeline. He doesn't use a scope anymore. He just watches, a silent steward to a procession that only he and the mountain remember. A ghostly reminder that the wilderness holds stories far older and stranger than any map can show. The silent bell pastor Michael Brody came to the small, rural Tennessee town of Chapel Hill seeking peace. He was a man of quiet faith, more comfortable with contemplation than with fire and brimstone sermons. His new charge was St. James Chapel, a beautiful old stone church built in the 1880s, complete with a bell tower that had stood silent for the better part of a century. The story, as the town elders told it, was that the bell's rope had snapped during a storm in the 1920s, and no one had ever gotten around to replacing it. The bell just hung there, a silent, oxidized sentinel against the sky. Michael found the silence fitting. His faith was a quiet one. But in September of 1999, the silence was broken, and the pastor's quiet world was thrown into a terrifying disharmony. The parish maintenance notes from that month begin with a simple entry. Investigate source of nocturnal ringing from bell tower. Rope remains severed. It started on a Sunday night, just after midnight. Michael was in the rectory next to the church, reading by a small lamp, when he heard it. A single, clear, resonant toll. Bong. The sound was so unexpected, so pure and loud in the night stillness that he dropped his book. It was the sound of the church bell. He rushed outside, his heart pounding. The night was calm, windless. He stared up at the dark silhouette of the bell tower. Silence. He must have imagined it. Maybe it was a sound from a distant farm or a car backfiring. Rational explanations. He clung to them. But the next night, it happened again. Midnight. A single, perfect toll that rolled across the sleeping town. This time, there was no denying it. The next morning, Michael took a key from a dusty box in the church office and climbed the narrow, winding stairs to the bell tower. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dry dust. At the top, in the belfry, hung the massive bronze bell, green with age. Just as the story said, there was no rope. The thick, frayed end of the old hemp rope was still tied to the bell's yoke, but the rest of it was long gone. It was impossible for it to have been rung. There was no mechanism, no electronic ringer, just a silent, disconnected bell. The mystery deepened. The midnight toll became a nightly occurrence. It was always just one, a single, solitary ring at the stroke of 12. The parishioners started talking. Some were frightened, believing it to be a bad omen. Others were intrigued, seeing it as a sign, a miracle. Michael was caught in the middle, a man of faith confronted by something that felt both holy and deeply unsettling. He organized a small group of parishioners to gather outside the church one night, just before midnight. They stood in the cool September air, their faces turned up toward the dark tower, a small, anxious congregation waiting for a sermon of a different kind. As the clock on the town hall a mile away began to strike 12, they all heard it. Bong. The sound was magnificent and terrifying. They saw it too. In the faint moonlight, they could all clearly see the massive bell swing, just once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if pushed by an invisible hand. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. There were no tricks, no wires, just the impossible ringing bell. Michael, a man who had dedicated his life to the unseen, felt a fear he had never known. This was not the gentle mystery of faith. This felt like something else, something ancient and powerful that was using the church for its own purposes. The rational explanations were now gone, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. Some people suggested underground tremors or blasting from a nearby quarry could be the cause. They were known to resonate with old structures. To prove or disprove this, Michael contacted a seismologist from the state university. A young, enthusiastic geologist arrived and installed sensitive vibration sensors at the base of the bell tower. For a week, he monitored the readings. The bell continued its single nightly toll. The geologist's findings only deepened the mystery. Every night, at precisely 12 a.m., the sensors logged a faint, localized tremor, but it wasn't seismic. It didn't match the signature of an earthquake or an explosion. The geologist described it as a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse originating from directly beneath the church. The vibrations were not strong enough to physically move a 2-ton bronze bell. The cause of the ringing remained a complete and utter mystery. The final entry in the parish maintenance log for that month is stark. Source of ringing remains unidentified. Specialist consulted, no conclusion. Monitoring ceased. The geologist, unable to explain his data, packed up his equipment and left, looking more confused than when he had arrived. Michael was left alone with his silent, screaming bell. He began to spend his days in the church archives, poring over old parish records, baptismal certificates, and funeral rites, searching for an answer. He found it in a leather-bound journal kept by the church's first pastor from the 1880s. The journal spoke of the church being built on unsettled ground, a place the local Native American tribes had avoided, calling it a place where the earth's heart beats too loud. The first pastor wrote of strange occurrences, of a persistent low hum that seemed to come from the stone floor of the chancel, a hum that was strongest around midnight. He had the bell cast and installed, hoping its holy sound would quiet the restless earth. For a time it seemed to work, but the journal ended with a hurried, fearful entry about the bell ringing on its own during a storm, just before the rope snapped. The pastor believed it was not the storm that had rung the bell, but something else, something answering from below. Michael Brodie now understood. The bell was not a herald of God. It was part of a conversation. The single toll was not a miracle. It was a response to a question asked by the earth itself. What he had first thought was a blessing now felt like a curse, a nightly reminder of the ancient, unknowable power that lay sleeping beneath the foundations of his church. He never tried to fix the rope. He came to accept the midnight toll as part of the life of the chapel, a somber, lonely heartbeat in the dark. He would lie in his bed in the rectory, and as the hour approached, he would hold his breath, waiting. The single clear note would ring out, a sound of perfect, terrifying clarity, and in the silence that followed, Michael would pray, not out of reverence, but out of a deep and abiding fear of the profound, patient silence that listened from below. The abandoned rail tunnel. For a certain kind of person, a place marked no trespassing is not a warning, but an invitation. Jason Mills was that kind of person, an urban explorer, or urbexer as he called himself. He saw beauty in decay, and history in the places that society had forgotten. His specialty was the abandoned infrastructure of West Virginia, derelict coal tipples, forgotten asylum wings, and most of all, the silent, gaping mouths of old railroad tunnels. In November of 2005, he set his sights on the Big Creek Tunnel, a CSX-owned passage that had been decommissioned in the late 70s. The official CSX tunnel closure file, which would later be pulled for an internal investigation, noted the tunnel's history of geological instability and unpredictable airflow. Jason saw only a challenge. The tunnel was a perfect specimen of industrial decay. The massive stone arch of its entrance was choked with ivy, and the tracks leading into it were rusted and warped, disappearing into a perfect, absolute darkness. Jason, armed with a powerful headlamp, a digital audio recorder, and a sense of invincibility, stepped from the bright autumn afternoon into the cold, damp air of the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately, and the sounds of the outside world, the wind in the trees, a distant bird call, were instantly snuffed out, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the crunch of his boots on the gravel ballast. His headlamp beam cut a clean white circle in the gloom, illuminating walls slick with moisture and calcite formations that looked like melting wax. The air was heavy, still, and smelled of wet earth and diesel fuel, a ghost of the long-gone locomotives. He ventured deeper, the entrance shrinking behind him to a small, bright pinhole of daylight. He was fascinated by the acoustics of such places. He would clap his hands and listen to the sharp echo rebound down the long, curved corridor. But in the Big Creek Tunnel, the sound was different. It didn't echo cleanly. It seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, to die with a strange, muffled thud. It was a dead space. After walking for what felt like a mile, he reached the tunnel's midpoint, a place of profound and total blackness, where the light from either end was completely gone. He switched off his headlamp, plunging himself into a sensory deprivation tank of his own making. The darkness was tangible, a physical pressure against his eyeballs. It was in this perfect listening silence that he first heard it. It was not a drip of water or the skittering of a rat. It was a slow, deep, rhythmic sound. Ah. Oh. It was the sound of breathing. It was immense, impossibly so, like the slow, sleeping respiration of a colossal beast. It seemed to come from the very air around him, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The sound was so deep and low that he felt it in his chest, a subsonic vibration that resonated with his own heartbeat. Jason's blood ran cold. He fumbled for his headlamp, his fingers shaking. He switched it on, the beam frantically slicing through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless curving empty tunnel. The sound continued, steady and unbothered by the light. His mind raced for a rational explanation. He knew that air currents in sealed tunnels could often sound organic when forced through narrow cracks or vents. It had to be the wind, a pressure differential between the two ends of the tunnel. He held up a small lighter. The flame was perfectly still, not even a flicker. There was no draft, no air movement at all. Yet the sound of breathing continued, a slow, patient, eternal rhythm. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. He was a mile deep inside a mountain, alone with a sound that should not exist. He switched on his digital audio recorder, holding it out into the darkness. He needed to capture this, to prove he wasn't going crazy. He recorded for a full minute, the sound of the immense, slow breathing filling the microphone. Then he turned and ran. He didn't look back. He just ran, his boots slipping on the wet gravel, his own ragged, panicked breaths drowned out by the slow, deep respiration that seemed to follow him, to fill the very space he was moving through. He burst out of the tunnel entrance into the sunlight, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned against the cold stone of the entrance, blinking in the bright afternoon. The sound of the wind in the trees, the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The next day, after his terror had subsided into a morbid curiosity, he contacted a friend who worked as a maintenance engineer for CSX. He told him a story about being a geology student studying airflow in abandoned tunnels. He asked, hypothetically, if there were any records of strange air pressure changes in the Big Creek Tunnel. The friend, intrigued, looked up the old files. What he found was unsettling. For years, automated airflow monitors, which had been left in the tunnel after its decommissioning, had logged abnormal and rhythmic pressure changes. The data showed a slow, steady cycle of pressure rising and falling, a pattern the engineers could never explain. They had nicknamed it the Big Creek Anomaly. The reports described it with a chilling lack of poetry as being consistent with the pressure displacement of a large, reciprocating air pump, or more organically, with pulmonary function. Lungs. The engineers' reports had, in their dry technical language, described the very thing Jason had heard. The tunnel itself was breathing. Driven by a mix of fear and a need for validation, Jason sent the audio file to his CSX friend. The engineer called him back within the hour, his voice strained. "Where did you get this? This sound? It matches the frequency of the pressure changes perfectly. It's the sound of the anomaly." A week later, things took a darker turn. A small earthquake, a minor tremor common in the region, shook the mountains. The Big Creek Tunnel, its structural integrity already compromised, suffered a major collapse. The entire middle section, the very place where Jason had stood in the darkness, caved in, sealing the tunnel permanently. The CSX closure file was updated with a final entry. November 28, 2005. Tunnel collapsed due to seismic activity. Passage permanently blocked. Site designated as critically unstable. No further access. Jason Mills never went back. He gave up urban exploring, the thrill of discovery replaced by a deep-seated fear of what lies waiting in the quiet, dark places of the world. He still has the audio recording, a small digital file on an old hard drive. He never listens to it. He doesn't need to. The sound is seared into his memory. The slow, deep, patient breath of the mountain. He is haunted by the thought that the tunnel collapse was not an accident. He wonders if the tremor was just a coincidence, or if the thing that had been sleeping deep within the earth had finally, after all those years, decided to shrug, to turn over in its sleep, and to seal the door to its bedroom forever. The Flickering Motel, the Sleepy Hollow motel in eastern Kentucky, was a relic, a tired survivor from the golden age of roadside travel. Its paint was peeling, its neon sign flickered with a desperate, buzzing energy, and most of its rooms were occupied by long-term residents who were as worn down as the motel itself. Ben, the night desk clerk, was a college student who had taken the job for the quiet hours it afforded him to study. His world was one of cheap coffee, the drone of the late-night movie on a small television, and the occasional guest checking in at 3 a.m. It was a boring, predictable job. Until the trouble started in room 6. The motel's repair invoice from January of 1987 is a strange document. It lists work done on room 6, but the description of the problem is unusually vague, citing recurrent, unpowered electrical phenomena. The solution listed is even stranger. Complete physical severance of all power lines leading to room. The story of that invoice began on a cold winter night when the guest in room 7 called the front desk to complain. He was an over-the-road trucker, tired and irritable. "Hey, pal," he grumbled into the phone. "You gotta do something about the room next door. The light keeps flashing. It's coming through my window, keeping me up." Ben frowned. Room 6 was empty. It had been for days. He assured the trucker he would take care of it and walked down the covered breezeway, the cold air biting at his face. He stood in front of room 6 and, sure enough, through the thin curtains he could see a faint, rhythmic flickering, like a faulty fluorescent bulb struggling to stay lit. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was cold and smelled of stale cigarette smoke. The only light was the flickering one coming from the bedside lamp. The bulb was strobing erratically, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the walls. Ben walked over and tried the switch. Nothing happened. The flickering continued, independent of the switch's position. He unplugged the lamp. The flickering stopped. Problem solved, he thought. A simple case of faulty wiring in the lamp itself. He made a note to have maintenance replace it in the morning, but the next night, another guest, this time across the courtyard, called to complain about a flickering light in room 6. Ben went to the room, his sense of déjà vu mixed with annoyance. He found the overhead ceiling light flickering this time, a slow, sickly pulse. He flipped the wall switch off. The light continued to flicker. Confused and a little unnerved, he went to the motel's main utility closet and found the breaker for room 6. He flipped it to the off position. The red indicator showed clearly that the circuit was dead. He walked back to room 6. The overhead light was still flickering. This was impossible. He was a physics student. He understood how electricity worked. A circuit had to be complete. There had to be a power source. What he was seeing defied the basic laws that governed his world. The flickering became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes it was the bathroom light, sometimes the lamp, sometimes the main ceiling fixture. It was never the same one twice. Guests began to complain about more than just the lights. They spoke of hearing voices, faint and muffled, coming from the walls of room 6. A woman in room 5 swore she heard a man and a woman having a whispered, angry argument late one night, even though the room was empty. Ben started to dread the quiet hours of his shift. He would sit at the front desk, staring at the security monitor that showed the empty breezeway in front of room 6, half expecting to see the light begin its ghostly dance. The owner of the motel, a gruff, pragmatic old man named Sal, was losing his patience with the complaints. He called in an electrician. The electrician spent an entire day in room 6, testing every wire, every outlet, every switch. He found nothing wrong. The wiring is old, but it's sound, he told Sal, shrugging. I can't find a single thing that would cause this, and the breaker is definitely cutting the power. I have no explanation. Sal, at the end of his rope, decided on a more drastic solution. If the electrician couldn't find the problem, they would simply remove the power altogether. He and the motel's handyman, a quiet man named Hector, went into the utility closet. They didn't just flip the breaker. They physically cut the main power lines that fed into room 6, pulling them out of the junction box and capping them with thick rubber insulators. There was now a complete and total air gap in the circuit. It was physically impossible for any electricity from the motel's system to reach that room. That night, Ben sat at his desk, a sense of relief washing over him. The problem was finally, definitively solved. Around 2 a.m., the phone rang. It was the guest in room 7 again. His voice was shaking. It's happening again, he whispered. The light. But it's worse now. And the voices. They're shouting. Ben's blood turned to ice. He walked slowly, hesitantly, down the breezeway to room 6. A frantic, chaotic strobing was emanating from the window. A silent, electrical seizure. He opened the door. Every single light in the room was on and flickering wildly. The bedside lamp, the overhead light, the bathroom vanity lights. They were all flashing in a mad, unsynchronized rhythm, filling the room with a nauseating, spastic energy. And beneath the hum of the struggling lights, he could hear it. The faint, muffled sound of shouting. A man and a woman, their voices filled with a venomous rage, seeming to come from inside the walls themselves. He backed out of the room, slamming the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran back to the office, grabbed the out of order sign, and hung it on the door of room 6. He refused to ever enter it again. The motel owner sealed the room permanently a few days later, boarding up the door and window. The official story was that the room had intractable wiring problems. But the flickering didn't stop. For years afterward, guests would still occasionally report seeing a strange, flashing light from the boarded-up window of the sealed room. Ben finished his degree and moved away, leaving the mysteries of the Sleepy Hollow Motel behind him. But he never forgot the sight of those lights, burning brightly and impossibly, fed by no discernible power source. He came to believe that some places, like some people, can hold onto a memory so tightly, so violently, that the energy of it stains the very walls, leaving an echo that can still find a way to switch on a light in a dead room, forever replaying a moment of rage and despair in a silent, flickering loop. The bridge weight. As a county engineer in Western Virginia, Marcus Thorne's job was to trust the data. He dealt in the precise, unforgiving world of load-bearing capacities, tensile strengths, and stress fractures. The old Haywood Creek Bridge, a steel truss structure built in the 1950s, was one of the dozens under his care. It was a sturdy, reliable bridge, but its age meant it needed monitoring. In 2012, his department had installed a new, state-of-the-art sensor system on the bridge, a network of strain gauges and load cells that provided real-time data on the stresses the bridge was enduring. The system was designed to detect overweight trucks trying to cheat the nearby weigh station. For the first few months, the data was exactly what Marcus expected. A steady stream of readings corresponding to the daily flow of traffic, with predictable peaks during morning and evening commutes. But in early December, an anomaly appeared in the data logs. An anomaly so strange, so persistent, that it began to consume him. The Department of Transportation Bridge Sensor log from December 2012 documents the events with cold, numerical precision. It starts with an entry at 2:03 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The load sensors on the bridge triggered, registering a vehicle of approximately 80,000 pounds, the maximum legal weight for a fully loaded tractor-trailer. A few minutes later, the sensors at the other end of the bridge registered the same weight as the vehicle exited. It was a perfectly normal event, except when Marcus cross-referenced the data with the security camera footage from the bridge, there was no truck. The camera, which recorded a time-lapsed image every 5 seconds, showed the bridge was completely empty at 2:03 a.m. Not a single car, let alone an 18-wheeler. Marcus dismissed it as a glitch. Faulty sensors and moisture were known to occasionally simulate phantom weights on older bridges. It was an electronic ghost, a product of cold weather and old wiring. He made a note to have a technician check the system, but the next night, it happened again. At 2:03 a.m., the sensors registered the exact same weight, 80,000 pounds. The crossing took the exact same amount of time. And again, the camera footage showed an empty, moonlit bridge. Now, Marcus was intrigued. A single glitch was an anomaly. A repeated glitch with identical data was a pattern. He pulled the logs for the entire week. Every single night, at precisely 2:03 a.m., the bridge believed a fully loaded truck was crossing it. The weight was always the same, down to the pound. The speed was always the same. The event was a perfect, ghostly replica, night after night. He sent a technician out to the bridge. The tech spent a full day running diagnostics on the entire sensor array. His report was unequivocal. The system was functioning perfectly. There were no faults, no moisture intrusion, no malfunctions of any kind. He even recalibrated the entire system just to be sure. That night, Marcus watched the live data feed from his home office, a knot of anticipation in his stomach. The minutes ticked by. At exactly 2:03 a.m., the graphs on his screen spiked. The load cells on the northbound side registered the immense weight. He watched the numbers as the phantom vehicle made its invisible journey across the 200-foot span. The data showed the weight shifting from one support pier to the next with perfect physical accuracy. Then the southbound sensors picked it up, and a few seconds later, the readings returned to 0. The crossing was complete. He immediately checked the live camera feed. Empty. A cold, profound unease settled over him. The data was real. The system was working. Therefore, the weight on the bridge was real. But where was it coming from? What could weigh 40 tons and be completely invisible? He started digging into the history of the bridge, spending his lunch hours in the county archive, scrolling through reels of old microfilm newspapers. He found it in a yellowed edition of the local paper from the winter of 1958. The headline was stark. Fuel tanker plunges from Haywood Bridge in icy crash. The article described a tragic accident. A tanker truck, carrying a full load of gasoline, had lost control on a patch of black ice in the middle of the night. It had jackknifed, smashed through the guardrail, and fallen into the rocky creek bed below, exploding on impact. The driver was killed instantly. The crash had happened on a Tuesday morning. The time of the accident, according to the state trooper's report, was approximately 2:03 a.m. The estimated weight of the truck and its full cargo was 80,000 pounds. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He was reading the ghost story of his data. He was tracking the echo of a tragedy that had happened over 50 years ago. A moment of violence and loss so profound that it had permanently imprinted itself onto the place where it happened. The invisible crossing was not random. It was a ritual, a ghostly reenactment. He went back to the bridge the next day, not as an engineer, but as a witness. He stood on the creek bank below, looking up at the steel structure that had been the site of such a violent end. The new guardrails were a different color from the rest of the bridge, a silent testament to the long-ago repair. He could almost imagine the scene. The screech of tires, the horrific grinding of metal, the final, terrible plunge into the darkness. He felt a deep sense of sorrow for the unknown driver, a man whose final moments were now trapped in a loop, endlessly replayed for an audience of sensitive electronics. The nightly crossings continued, a spectral fixture in the bridge's data log. Marcus stopped trying to explain them. He listed the events in his official reports as unidentified recurring sensor anomalies pending further investigation, a bureaucratic euphemism for the inexplicable. He never sent another technician. What was there to fix? The bridge wasn't broken. It was haunted. The phantom crossings finally stopped a few years later, when the old Haywood Creek Bridge was replaced with a new, modern concrete structure. The old steel truss was dismantled piece by piece, its haunted bones sold for scrap. The new bridge, with its own new sensor system, has never registered a phantom weight. The data is clean, predictable, and soulless. But Marcus Thorne, now retired, sometimes drives out to the new bridge around 2 a.m. He parks his car and looks at the spot where the old bridge used to be. He wonders if the ghost of that truck still makes its journey, no longer having a physical structure to cross, just driving on a bridge of memory. Its immense weight now carried only by the cold night air. He wonders if the silence means the driver has finally found peace, or if his tragedy is just no longer measurable by the tools of the modern world. The quarry floodlight. The old North Star limestone quarry had been silent for 20 years, a great tiered wound carved into the side of a lonely hill in central Pennsylvania. By day, it was a place of stark geometric beauty, its white stone walls dropping hundreds of feet to a placid, unnaturally blue pool of water that had filled its deepest recesses. By night, it was a pit of absolute, impenetrable blackness. The job of the security guard was not to protect anything valuable. There was nothing left to steal, but to keep local teenagers from using the quarry as a late-night swimming hole. It was a boring, lonely job, and that suited George Finney just fine. George was a retired mill worker, a man who preferred the company of the wind and the stars to other people. His post was a small, cinder-block guard shack at the quarry's main gate, a mile from the pit itself. His duties were simple: sit, watch the gate, and call the sheriff if any cars showed up. For months, the nights were uneventful, measured only by the chapters in his paperback novels and the thermos of coffee he brought from home. But one night, in August of 2000, something impossible happened. A light appeared in the darkness. George was looking out his window toward the quarry pit when a brilliant, powerful beam of light sliced through the night. It was one of the old industrial floodlights, mounted on a tower at the edge of the pit, the kind they used for night shifts back when the quarry was active. The beam swept across the vast stone amphitheater, illuminating the sheer white walls with a ghostly glare. George sat bolt upright, his heart suddenly pounding. This was wrong. Terribly wrong. The power to the quarry had been cut off years ago. He knew this for a fact. The massive power lines that had once fed the site now lay coiled and useless on the ground near the abandoned transformer station. The place was a dead zone. The County Power Authority had confirmed this in a note to the security company when they took the contract. A note which stated, "No live line feeds to North Star Quarry property." So what was he seeing? He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and his radio. "This is Finney at North Star. I've got a light on at the main pit. A floodlight." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, confused. "A floodlight, George? Are you sure? There's no power out there." "I'm sure," George said, his voice tight. "I'm looking right at it. It's sweeping the pit, like it's looking for something." He got in his old pickup truck and drove down the winding gravel road toward the pit, his headlights a feeble challenge to the immense darkness. The floodlight from the tower continued its slow, methodical sweep. As he got closer, he could see the light tower itself, a skeletal steel structure silhouetted against the beam it was casting. There was no sound, no hum of a generator, just the silent, impossible light. He parked the truck 100 yards from the tower and got out, his flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The air was still and warm. The beam from above swept over him, and for a second, he was blinded, caught in a brilliant white glare. It felt like being watched. A deep, instinctual fear, the kind he hadn't felt since he was a child, gripped him. He was a rational man. He believed in cause and effect. There had to be an explanation. Someone had brought in a portable generator. It was the only possibility. He walked toward the base of the light tower, his flashlight beam aimed at the ground, searching for a generator, for cables, for any sign of human activity. He found nothing. The ground was undisturbed. The base of the tower was thick with weeds and rust. There were no wires running up the tower. The conduit that had once carried the power was rusted through and empty. The light source was inexplicable. As he stood there, staring up at the impossible light, it suddenly went out. Not with a flicker or fade, but instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The darkness that crashed down was absolute, a physical weight that seemed to suck the air from his lungs. The silence that followed was even more profound. He was alone in the vast, dark pit. The sheriff's deputy, who arrived 20 minutes later, found George sitting in his truck, pale and shaken. The deputy, a young man who had grown up in the area, listened to George's story with a patient, skeptical air, they both walked to the light tower. In the beam of their flashlights, it was just a piece of derelict industrial equipment, cold and inert. The deputy pointed to the disconnected power lines. "See, George? Nothing's connected. Must have been some kids with a spotlight trying to spook you." George knew it wasn't a spotlight. The beam had originated from the floodlight fixture itself, high up on the tower. He had seen it, but he had no proof. The event was logged as a probable trespasser activity. The next day, a crew from the power company came out at the security firm's request. They confirmed, once again, that the entire site was electrically dead. One of the linemen, an old-timer who had worked in the area for 40 years, offered a different explanation. He told George about residual charges, how large industrial capacitors could sometimes hold a charge for years and then discharge unexpectedly, causing a brief surge of light. It was a plausible, scientific-sounding explanation. It did not, however, explain why the light had stayed on for nearly an hour, or why it had swept back and forth across the quarry pit in a slow, searching pattern. The light did not appear again for a week. George began to convince himself that it had been a fluke, a one-time atmospheric trick. Then, it returned. The same silent, sweeping beam, cutting through the darkness. This time, George didn't call it in. He just sat in his shack and watched. He felt like he was a witness to something not meant for him, a private ritual of the abandoned place. He started to think about the history of the quarry, the accidents, the men who had died there over the years, falling from the high walls or caught in the rock-crushing machinery. He wondered if the light was looking for them. The light became a semi-regular occurrence, appearing every few nights, always after midnight. It never made a sound. It just performed its silent, sweeping search and then vanished. George stopped trying to understand it. He simply accepted it as part of the quarry's nocturnal life, as natural as the owls that hunted in the darkness. The security company eventually installed a camera overlooking the pit. The camera recorded the light, a brilliant, ghostly beam moving in the dark. But when crews were sent to investigate during the day, they always found the same thing: a dead, disconnected piece of machinery in a place with no power. The mystery of the quarry floodlight was never solved. It remains an anomaly in a file, a story told by an old security guard. George Finney finished his contract and retired for good, but he never forgot the silent, searching light. He came to believe that some places, especially those carved violently from the earth, hold a kind of energy, a memory of the light and noise and work that once filled them. And sometimes, on a quiet night, that memory becomes strong enough to reach out, to throw a switch that no longer exists, and to cast a lonely, searching light over a place that has long since fallen silent. The Coal Camp Ledger. Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who lived in the past. As a historian at West Virginia University, his life's work was to sift through the brittle yellowed pages of history to find the stories of the forgotten people who had built the state. In the fall of 2018, he was cataloging a recent acquisition, a collection of documents from the abandoned Blackwood Coal Camp, a town that had thrived in the 1920s and died in the 1950s when the coal seam ran dry. The collection was mostly what he expected: company store receipts, miners' union correspondence, and the mundane records of a long-dead town. But among the dusty boxes, he found a ledger, a large, leather-bound book from the camp's infirmary. The ledger was a meticulous record of births, deaths, and injuries, its pages filled with elegant, looping cursive. It was a poignant, tangible connection to the lives and hardships of the miners and their families. It was while cross-referencing the ledger with the camp's final census records from 1951 that Alistair found the first impossibility. A university archive anomaly note, dated October 2018, records his initial query. Infirmary ledger shows entry dated 1956. Camp officially abandoned 1952. Possible clerical error? The entry was for a birth, a boy, Thomas Miller, born to Sarah and John Miller on June the 12th, 1956. The handwriting was a perfect match for the camp doctor who had made all the other entries, but it was impossible. The town of Blackwood had been a ghost town for 4 years by that date. The doctor, Alistair confirmed, had died in 1954 in a different city altogether. He assumed it was a simple mistake, a miswritten date, a common enough error. He made a note of the discrepancy and moved on. But then he found another, an injury report for a miner named Samuel Jones, dated September 1958. A broken leg from a slip on the tipple. The Blackwood coal tipple had collapsed in the winter of 1953. Again, the handwriting was a perfect match for the deceased doctor. Alistair felt a chill creep up his spine. These weren't just errors. This was a pattern. He began to go through the ledger page by page, comparing every date after 1952 with historical records. He found dozens of entries, births, illnesses, even deaths, all meticulously recorded in the years after the town had ceased to exist. They were phantom events in a ghost town, logged by a dead man's hand. The names in the ledger were real. They were all former residents of Blackwood. Alistair cross-referenced them with census data. Sarah and John Miller had lived in the camp. Samuel Jones had been a miner there. But they had all moved away when the mine closed, scattering across the country. How could they be appearing in the camp's infirmary ledger years after they had left? The rational historian in him searched for an explanation. Perhaps the ledger had been taken by the doctor when he left, and he had continued to use it for personal notes. But that didn't explain the specific Blackwood-related events. Maybe it was a forgery, a clever hoax. But the ink was a perfect chemical match to the rest of the book, and the aging of the paper was consistent. There was no logical explanation. The ledger became an obsession for Alistair. He spent late nights in the university's special collections archive, a silent, climate-controlled room where the only sound was the soft rustle of turning pages. The ledger sat on a special stand under a soft light, looking ancient and inscrutable. The most disturbing entries were near the end of the book. The handwriting, still recognizably the doctor's, became more frantic, more scrawled. The entries were no longer just records of medical events. They became strange, desperate notes. "They won't leave," one entry from 1961 read. "The town is empty, but they won't leave. They keep coming to me. They don't know it's over." Another from 1963. "Marianne came today. Cried about her boy's fever. I reminded her that her boy passed from influenza in '48. She didn't seem to remember." The final entry in the book was dated May the 2nd, 1965. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the pen having dug deep into the paper. It read, "The silence is the worst part. The silence where the whistles and the trains should be. But the people are still here. I see them walking the muddy streets. I hear their coughing through the thin walls. They are all still here. They signed the company ledger when they arrived, and they never signed out. They never left. They don't know how. I am the only one left to record their ghosts. My ink is running low, my hand is tired. I think tonight I will finally go and join the..." The entry stopped abruptly, mid-word. The rest of the page, and indeed, the rest of the ledger, was blank. Alistair sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. He was holding a dead man's journal. a record of a town that had refused to die, its memories continuing to play out long after its physical existence had ended. The doctor, it seemed, had been trapped there with them, his own spirit bound to his duty, to his ledger. Seeking some form of proof beyond the ledger itself, Alistair requested the security footage from the archive room for the previous few nights. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just had a hunch, a desperate, irrational feeling. The archivist, a prim, skeptical woman, reluctantly agreed. The next day, she called him to her office, her face pale. She played the footage for him on her monitor. It was a time-lapse video of the empty, silent archive room. The ledger was visible on its stand in the center of the frame. For hours, nothing happened. Then, around 3 a.m., something moved. The heavy leather cover of the ledger slowly, impossibly, lifted on its own. The pages began to turn, one by one, as if stirred by an unseen reader. They stopped on a specific page, stayed open for a few minutes, and then the book slowly closed itself. It happened every night. Alistair felt a wave of nausea. The ledger was not just a record, it was active. It was still being written, still being read, by hands that were no longer there. The university, faced with an artifact that defied all rational explanation, quietly removed the Blackwood Infirmary ledger from the public catalog. It now sits in a locked, climate-controlled vault, its story known only to a handful of people. The official note in the archive simply lists it as structurally unstable and awaiting preservation. But Alistair Finch knows the truth. He knows that the stories of the Blackwood coal camp are not over. He understands that a place can hold on to its people so tightly that they are never allowed to leave, their lives and sorrows continuing to echo, their names still being entered year after year in a phantom ledger by a ghostly hand. The hollow static. In the dispatch center of a rural Virginia county, the night shift was usually a slow, hypnotic affair. For Maria Flores, a seasoned 911 dispatcher, it was a familiar rhythm of routine calls and long stretches of quiet. Her world was a cocoon of glowing screens and the soft hum of electronics, a calm hub in the center of the county's nocturnal chaos. But in the humid, insect-loud nights of July 2009, a series of calls began to come through that were anything but routine. They were calls from a place that no longer existed, from phones that had long been disconnected. The county's 911 archive from that summer contains the digital recordings, logged as unidentified signal interference. The first call came in just after 1 a.m. It wasn't a voice, just a wall of crackling, hissing static. But underneath the noise, there was something else, something faint and rhythmic. It sounded like a woman, softly humming a lullaby. The call lasted for 30 seconds and then disconnected. The system, as it was designed to do, attempted to trace the call's origin. The coordinates that appeared on Maria's screen were for a remote, wooded area deep in the foothills, known locally as Blackwood Hollow. There were no registered residences, no cell towers, nothing but trees and dirt tracks. Maria logged it as a phantom call, a technical glitch, and forgot about it. But the next night, another call came through. The same overwhelming static, but this time, underneath it, the clear sound of a child crying. The sound was distant, filled with a heartbreaking sorrow. Again, the call traced to the same coordinates in Blackwood Hollow. Maria felt a prickle of unease. She checked the county's historical maps. Blackwood Hollow had once been a small, thriving community, settled in the early 20th century. But it had been effectively wiped off the map in the 1960s when the state had built a dam, flooding the valley to create a new reservoir. The entire community had been relocated, their homes and farms swallowed by the rising waters. The place the calls were coming from was now at the bottom of a deep lake. The calls continued, becoming a nightly occurrence. Each one was a fragment of a life, a soundbite of domesticity buried under a shroud of static. The clink of silverware, a man's low laughter, the barking of a dog, a screen door slamming shut. It was as if she were listening to the ghosts of a drowned town, their ordinary moments bleeding through time and technology. The most chilling part was the call IDs. The system automatically logged the number of the incoming call. The numbers that were coming through were all disconnected. When Maria ran them through the old telephone company databases, they all traced back to the families who had once lived in Blackwood Hollow. She was receiving calls from phones that had been ripped out of the walls 50 years ago, phones that now lay rotting in the silt at the bottom of a lake. Her supervisor told her it had to be a technical issue. Cellular repeaters in the deep valleys were known to sometimes malfunction, to recycle and amplify old signals under certain atmospheric conditions. It was a plausible theory, a neat technological box to put the strangeness in, but it didn't feel right. The calls were too specific, too personal. One night, a call came through that was clearer than the others. The static was still there, but a woman's voice cut through it, panicked and urgent. "The water," the voice said, her words distorted by the electronic noise. "It's coming up so fast. Get the children upstairs. Hurry!" Then, a sound like a roar, the sound of rushing water, and the line went dead. Maria sat in her chair, her body trembling. She was not listening to a signal bounce. She was listening to a memory. She was hearing the final, terrified moments of a family who had not gotten out in time. A local legend she had always dismissed as a ghost story. The legend told of a family who had refused to leave their home, who had been caught by the floodwaters when the dam was sealed. She pulled up the old news articles about the creation of the reservoir. There, in a small, forgotten report, was the story. The Henderson family. They had been holdouts, refusing to sell their land to the state. An injunction had been issued, but a sudden storm had accelerated the filling of the valley. By the time the authorities arrived to forcibly evict them, their farmhouse was already submerged. Their bodies were never recovered. The phone number from that panicked call had been registered to a Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. Maria felt like a voyeur, an unwilling audience to a decades-old tragedy. The hollow wasn't just haunted. Its final moments were trapped in the very air, its dying pleas still searching for a signal, for someone to hear them. She couldn't shake the feeling that the drowned town was trying to speak, to tell its story through the only means it had. The calls became an obsession. She would sit through her shift, waiting, dreading the next crackle of static, the next fragment of a lost life. The other dispatchers thought she was losing her nerve, letting the stress of the job get to her. She couldn't explain to them what she was hearing, how the static felt like water filling her own lungs. The calls stopped as suddenly as they had begun. At the end of July, the nightly transmissions ceased. The static fell silent. The drowned voices of Blackwood Hollow were gone. The official explanation in the 911 archive is that a faulty repeater on a nearby mountain was identified and repaired, ending the signal interference. But Maria Flores knows what she heard. She can no longer look at the placid blue surface of the reservoir without thinking of the town that lies beneath, a modern-day Atlantis in the heart of the Virginia woods. She thinks of the homes, the streets, the lives, all submerged in the cold, silent dark. and she knows that for one strange, terrifying month, the residents of that town found a way to make their presence known, their voices reaching out from their watery graves, their memories encoded in a stream of ghostly static, a final, desperate call from a place that had been erased from the map, but not from time itself. The Fire Tower Light. In the vast, lonely wilderness of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, the job of a fire tower lookout was a study in solitude. For Ethan Cole, a seasonal employee with the Forest Service, it was a welcome escape from the noise of the modern world. His home was a small glass-walled cabin perched atop a 100-foot steel tower, and his only companions were the wind, the hawks, and the endless green sea of the forest canopy that stretched to the horizon. His job was simple: watch for smoke. But in the dry, tense autumn of 1993, during a strict burn ban, he began to see lights on a distant ridge, lights that had no business being there. The USFS incident log from October of that year documents his reports with a detached, professional tone. October 12th, sighting of possible illegal campfire on Black Balsam Ridge. Patrol dispatched. No findings. From his vantage point, Ethan had a god's eye view of the surrounding mountains. He knew every ridge, every valley, every remote clearing. So when he saw the flicker of what looked like a lantern on the barren, rocky spine of Black Balsam Knob, a place with no official trails, he immediately radioed it in. It was a fire risk, plain and simple. He watched through his binoculars as a ground patrol made its way to the area. He could see their flashlight beams dancing through the trees below the ridge. But when they arrived at the spot where he had seen the light, they found nothing. No campers, no fire pit, no footprints, nothing but wind-scoured rock and rhododendron. Ethan was confused. He had a clear view. He knew what he had seen. His supervisor told him it was probably just atmospheric reflection, distant headlights from the Blue Ridge Parkway bouncing off a layer of haze, a phenomenon often mistaken for lanterns in the high ridges. Ethan, a man of practical mind, accepted the explanation, though it felt unsatisfactory. But a week later, the light appeared again. It was in the exact same spot on the ridge, a single, steady point of orange light, like a kerosene lantern. It appeared just after dusk and burned for a few hours before vanishing. This time, Ethan didn't just watch. He used the tower's Osborne Firefinder, a precise mapping tool, to get an exact bearing on the light's location. He also took a long exposure photograph with his camera. The next day, he hiked to the location himself. The trek took him hours, bushwhacking through dense, untamed forest. When he reached the spot on the ridge his firefinder had indicated, he found nothing. The place was a desolate, windswept outcrop of rock, offering no shelter. No one would choose to camp there. There was no soot on the rocks, no sign of a fire ever having been there. Yet he knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the place. The mystery gnawed at him. The lights continued to appear, always on the same night of the week, always in the same location. They became a fixture of his lonely vigil. His repeated reports were met with increasing skepticism from his superiors. He was the man in the isolated tower, perhaps letting the solitude get to him. Frustrated, he began his own research, spending his off days in the library of a nearby town, poring over old maps and local histories. He learned that the area around Black Balsam Knob had a dark past. In the 19th century, it had been a remote, lawless place, home to families who lived by their own rules. He found a story, more a piece of local folklore than a documented event, about a revenue agent who had gone into the mountains to bust an illegal moonshine operation and had never been seen again. The legend said he had been captured by the family of moonshiners, and that they had taken him to the highest, most exposed ridge to make an example of him. The story was vague on the details of his fate, but it ended with the eerie claim that his spirit still haunted the ridge, his lantern still searching for a way back to civilization. Ethan felt a chill as he read the old, brittle newspaper account. The ridge they described was Black Balsam Knob. He went back to his tower with a new sense of dread. The light on the ridge was no longer just a curiosity. It felt like a warning, a piece of history that refused to stay buried. He looked at the photographs he had taken. The light in each one was identical, a small, perfect flare of orange in the vast darkness, always in the precise same position. It wasn't a campfire, which would flicker and change shape. It was a single, constant source. The final report in the USFS log is brief. All reports of anomalous lights on Black Balsam Ridge officially designated as recurring atmospheric phenomena. Case closed. The burn ban was eventually lifted as the autumn rains arrived, and Ethan's seasonal contract ended. He left the tower and the lonely mountains, but the image of the solitary light on the ridge stayed with him. He had been a lookout, a man trained to spot a single, misplaced spark in a million acres of wilderness. He knew the difference between a reflection and a flame. He knew he had been watching something real. He came to believe the folklore was true. He believed he had been watching the ghost of a lost man, a lonely sentinel trapped on a high, cold ridge, lighting his lantern every week in a desperate, eternal hope that someone might see his signal and show him the way home. Ethan Cole had seen the signal, but he knew, with a deep and sorrowful certainty, that there was no rescue he could offer. The light on Black Balsam Knob was not a fire that needed to be extinguished, but a memory that could never be put out. The mill pond Walter Schmidt was a man of routines. A retired machinist from a small Pennsylvania town, his days were governed by the rising of the sun, the precise time he drank his morning coffee, and the evening walk he took around the old abandoned mill pond at the edge of his property. The pond was a placid, murky body of water, a remnant of an industrial age that had long since passed. For Walter, it was a place of quiet contemplation. But in the summer of 1982, the pond's quiet rhythm was disturbed by a phenomenon so subtle, so regular, that it bordered on the sublime and the terrifying. The United States Geological Survey has a water monitoring record from that year, a brief file noting a civilian report of unexplained, rhythmic surface ripples in a private pond. The official conclusion was probable subterranean gas release. The reality for Walter was far stranger. It began in July. Every evening as dusk was settling and the fireflies were beginning to stitch their patterns in the air, he would sit on his porch overlooking the pond. And every evening, at precisely 9:40 p.m., it would happen. A series of perfect, concentric ripples would emanate from the exact center of the pond. They would spread outward, silent and serene, until they lapped gently at the grassy banks, and then the pond would become still again. It happened only once a night. Walter, a man whose life had been dedicated to the precise mechanics of gears and levers, was fascinated. His first thought was fish. A large carp or bass, perhaps, rising to the surface at the same time each night. But the ripples were too perfect, too centered. They didn't have the chaotic splash of a feeding fish. He sat by the pond's edge for a week, watching intently. No fish ever broke the surface. His next thought was a spring. He knew that subterranean springs could sometimes create unexplained surface disturbances, but the timing was the problem. A natural spring would be random or constant. It would not adhere to a precise, man-made schedule. 9:40 p.m. every single night. He began to keep a logbook, noting the time, the weather conditions, the perfect, silent appearance of the ripples. The pattern was unwavering. It was as if the pond had a hidden clock, an appointment it had to keep. The regularity of it began to feel less like a natural phenomenon and more like a deliberate act. It was unnatural. He tried to find the source. He built a small raft and paddled out to the center of the pond, the spot where the ripples originated. He dropped a weighted line to measure the depth. It was 12 feet deep, with a soft, silty bottom. He felt nothing unusual. He even waded into the murky, cool water, feeling the mud squish between his toes, searching for any kind of vent or pipe. He found nothing. The pond was just a simple earth-dug basin. His machinist's brain, trained to diagnose and solve problems, was stumped. The pond was a closed system, a machine that was performing an action without any visible mechanism. His neighbors thought he was getting eccentric in his old age, spending his evenings just staring at a body of water. He couldn't make them understand the profound, quiet strangeness of what he was witnessing. It was a perfect, beautiful, and deeply unsettling mystery. Driven by a need for a scientific answer, he contacted the USGS. A young, bored-looking geologist came out, took some water samples, and used a sonar device to map the pond's bottom. His report was anticlimactic. The sonar showed no anomalies, no springs, no geological fissures. The water was clean. He concluded, with a distinct lack of conviction, that it was most likely small, periodic releases of swamp gas from the decaying matter at the bottom. It was the most logical explanation, but it failed to account for the clockwork precision of the events. Swamp gas is random. It is not punctual. The ripples continued for months, a silent, nightly ritual. Walter came to see them not with fear, but with a kind of reverence. He stopped trying to explain them. He simply watched. It felt like he was a witness to a secret heartbeat, a quiet, rhythmic breath from something hidden deep in the earth beneath the pond. He researched the history of the land. He learned that before the mill was built, the area had been the site of a tragic train derailment in the late 1800s. A passenger train had plunged into a creek that had once run where the pond now sat. Many lives were lost. The accident had happened late in the evening. Walter could never find a record of the exact time. Then, one night in late October, the ripples stopped. 9:40 p.m. came and went. The pond remained perfectly still, a dark mirror reflecting the autumn moon. They never appeared again. The silence and stillness that returned to the pond felt different to Walter. It felt final. The absence of the ripples was more profound and unsettling than their presence had ever been. It was like a clock that had stopped ticking, a heartbeat that had ceased. The official record remains a probable gas release. But Walter Schmidt, until the day he died, believed he had been watching something else. He believed the pond was a place of memory, and that the ripples were an echo of a long-forgotten tragedy. He imagined the final, shuddering impact of the train, the moment of violent entry into the water, a shockwave that had somehow become imprinted on the place itself. For one long summer, the pond had remembered, replaying its trauma every night at the same exact time. And then, for reasons as mysterious as their appearance, it had finally, after all those years, let go and fallen silent. The gas well. In the rolling foothills of Ohio, the natural gas industry is a landscape of steel and science. For a drilling crew foreman like Mike Costas, The world was a series of measurable pressures, flow rates, and the satisfying roar of a successful wellhead. He was a practical man, a problem solver who trusted his gauges and his gut. In 2011, his crew was working a new pad, a site deep in the woods where they had just sunk a successful well. The well was capped and padlocked, waiting for the pipeline connection. It was a quiet, dormant site. But the well, it seemed, was not sleeping soundly. The gas company's maintenance file for the site contains a series of perplexing work orders from that period, citing unexplained pressure fluctuations and site tampering. The first sign of trouble was on the gauges. Every morning, when Mike's crew arrived on site, the pressure gauges on the wellhead showed a slight but noticeable drop from the previous evening. It was as if a small amount of gas had been bled off overnight. His first thought was a leak, a faulty valve, a bad weld. A gas leak was a serious, dangerous problem. He and his team spent 2 full days inspecting every inch of the complex steel Christmas tree assembly that capped the well. They used sophisticated gas detectors, soap tests on every joint, and ultrasonic scanners. They found nothing. The wellhead was sealed tight as a drum, yet the pressure continued to drop, just a little bit, every single night. Mike's second thought was human intervention. Someone was sneaking onto their remote site at night and tapping the line, stealing gas. It seemed unlikely, but not impossible. He checked the heavy-duty padlocks on the valve handles. They were secure. He even put a thin layer of grease on the handles, a classic old-timers trick to see if they had been touched. The next morning, the grease was undisturbed. The locks were intact, but the pressure was down again. The mystery deepened. He reported the issue to the company, and they authorized the installation of a motion-activated security camera. The camera was mounted on a pole, overlooking the entire well pad. The first night's footage showed nothing but deer wandering past and the occasional owl swooping through the frame. But the gauges in the morning told the same story. The pressure had dropped. Frustrated and confused, Mike began to watch the time-lapse footage himself, frame by frame. And he saw it. It was so subtle, so brief that he almost missed it. In the deep blue darkness of the pre-dawn hours, the handle on one of the main shutoff valves, a heavy iron wheel that required significant force to turn, moved. It turned a quarter turn, opening the valve. And then, a few minutes later, it turned back, closing it. There was no one there. The handle moved on its own. He watched the footage again and again, his rational mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, a compression artifact in the video, but it was there, undeniable. The wheel turned. A profound sense of unease settled over the worksite. The crew, a bunch of rough, pragmatic men, started to get spooked. They talked in low voices about the old stories of the woods, the strange things that happened in the deep, isolated parts of the country. Tools began to disappear. A heavy pipe wrench left by the wellhead would be gone in the morning. A set of specialized gauges would vanish from a locked truck. There were no footprints, no signs of a break-in. The items were simply gone. The atmosphere on the site grew tense, charged with a nervous, watchful energy. The men started working faster, eager to finish the pipeline connection and leave the place behind. Mike felt like his authority was slipping, not to his men, but to the site itself. The place felt like it was actively working against them, resisting their intrusion. He started to research the history of the land they were drilling on. He learned from an old county map that their well pad was located on the site of an old, forgotten family cemetery. The graves had been moved in the 1940s to make way for a logging operation, but the land, it seemed, had not forgotten. The rational explanation from the company engineers was that pressure fluctuations in the shale seams deep underground were causing the spontaneous pressure drops. It was a known geological phenomenon. This explanation, however, did not account for the valve handle that turned itself or the tools that vanished into thin air. One evening, as the crew was packing up, one of the younger workers let out a yell. He was pointing toward the edge of the woods. A large, heavy sledgehammer that had been leaning against a truck was now standing perfectly balanced on its head in the middle of the clearing. It was a physical impossibility, a moment of surreal, silent defiance. That was the final straw. The crew refused to work the site anymore. Mike, unable to explain what was happening and unwilling to force his men, had to report the situation to his superiors. A new crew was brought in, but they experienced the same strange occurrences. The project fell behind schedule, plagued by a series of inexplicable malfunctions and equipment losses. The gas company, in a move that was highly unusual and costly, eventually decided to abandon the well. They capped it permanently with concrete and dismantled the wellhead assembly. The official reason given in the maintenance file was unrecoverable geological instability. Mike Costas never went back to that site. He continued his career, drilling other wells in other places, but the memory of the turning valve handle and the perfectly balanced sledgehammer never left him. He came to believe that they had disturbed something in those woods, something old and territorial. They had drilled a hole into a place that did not want to be opened, and the land itself, with a quiet and inscrutable intelligence, had pushed them out. It had stolen their tools, played with their machinery, and bled its own pressure, not out of malfunction, but out of a slow, deliberate, and patient act of resistance. The hollow school bus Earl Thompson's life was mapped by the school bus routes of rural West Virginia. For 40 years, he had driven those winding, hollow roads. His big yellow bus, a familiar, rumbling presence in the lives of generations of children. When he retired in the late 1980s, his bus, old number 17, was retired with him, sent to the county scrapyard to be dismantled. Earl had a photograph of it, taken on his last day, a proud, sentimental keepsake. So, on a crisp autumn morning in 1990, when he saw number 17 parked behind the old elementary school, he felt a profound sense of temporal dislocation, as if the world had somehow slipped a gear. The county school board transport log for that year has no record of the event. It was a story that was never officially told, a memory that existed only in the bewildered mind of a retired bus driver. Earl had been taking his morning walk, a route that took him past the school where he had started and ended his day for 4 decades. The school itself was still in use, but the back lot, where the buses used to park, was now just an empty, cracked expanse of asphalt. And there it was, instantly recognizable. The faded 17 painted on its side, the specific pattern of rust above the right headlight, the small dent in the rear bumper from a minor fender bender in '78. It was his bus, but it was wrong. The vibrant yellow paint was gone, stripped down to the bare, rust-streaked metal. The windows were all smashed out, and the interior was a dark, hollowed-out cavern. It looked like it had been sitting in a junkyard for years, which, of course, it should have been. Earl approached the bus slowly, a strange mix of nostalgia and dread churning in his stomach. How did it get here? And why was it in such a state? It looked like a corpse, a skeletal mockery of the cheerful, rumbling vehicle he had driven. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the gentle breeze. He pulled it open and stepped inside. The inside was completely stripped. The rows of green vinyl seats were gone. The floor was bare metal, and the walls were covered in a strange, dark grime. It was a hollow, empty shell. He walked the length of the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. Everything was gone, except for one thing: the driver's seat. It was still there, its vinyl cracked and torn, but otherwise intact. It was his seat. He reached out and placed his hand on it. The vinyl was warm, not just sun-warmed, but retaining a deep, internal heat, as if someone had just been sitting there. A cold shock went through him. He was alone in the empty lot. The sun was barely up, and the air was chilly. There was no reason for the seat to be warm. He backed away slowly, his heart starting to race. He looked at the dashboard. The keys were in the ignition, dangling silently. He knew he shouldn't, but an overwhelming compulsion seized him. He slid into the driver's seat. The warmth enveloped him. He turned the key. Nothing happened. The engine was long dead, probably seized with rust. But as his fingers touched the key, a faint, ghostly sound filled the empty bus. It was the sound of children laughing and talking, a cacophony of cheerful, youthful energy. It was the sound of his past, the sound that had been the background music of his entire working life. He could almost smell the bubble gum and the wet raincoats. The sound was all around him, an auditory hallucination so real he could feel the vibrations in the floor. He scrambled out of the bus, his breath catching in his throat. The moment his feet touched the asphalt outside, the sound stopped. The bus was silent again, a dead, hollow thing. He ran. He didn't stop until he reached his house, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. Later that day, after his panic had subsided, he called the school district's transportation director, a man he had known for years. He asked about old number 17. The director was confused. "Earl, that bus was crushed for scrap 2 years ago. I signed the paperwork myself. I watched them do it." He even pulled the file. The vehicle identification number was logged, the date of destruction recorded. According to all official records, Earl's bus did not exist anymore. Yet it was sitting there, in the back lot of the school. Earl went back the next morning, needing to see it again in the clear light of day, to prove to himself that he hadn't imagined it. The lot was empty. The bus was gone. There were no tire tracks, no oil stains, no sign that it had ever been there. It had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The story became Earl's quiet, unbelievable secret. He knew what he had seen. He knew the warmth he had felt in the driver's seat, the sounds he had heard. He believed that, for one brief morning, his bus had come back. It had made one last run, not on the roads of the living, but on the routes of memory. He thought about the warmth in the seat and wondered who or what had been driving it. He imagined a phantom driver, maybe even a version of his younger self, still making his rounds, still picking up the ghostly children who waited on the street corners of the past. It was a comforting thought, but also a deeply unsettling one. Earl Thompson lived for another 10 years, but he never walked past the old school again. He couldn't bear to look at the empty lot, a place where he had once come face to face with a piece of his own life that should have been dead and buried, a hollow, rusted ghost that had returned for one last, silent journey home. The power plant's siren. The decommissioned Black River Power Station was a monument to a dying era. Its colossal cooling towers stood silent against the Ohio sky. their concrete sides stained with decades of weather. The coal-fired heart of the plant had been cold for years, and the sprawling complex was in the slow process of being dismantled. Frank Hewitt's job was to be its caretaker, a security guard for a sleeping giant. His nights were long and silent, punctuated only by the screech of an owl or the distant rumble of a freight train. The silence was the point. The plant was dead. But one night, in April of 2004, the giant stirred in its sleep. The Environmental Protection Agency's decommission file for the plant includes a brief, curious addendum. Reports of unauthorized siren activation. Electrical engineering team dispatched. Findings: no power source identified. Siren subsequently physically dismantled. Frank was in his guard shack near the main gate when the sound began. It started as a low hum, a vibration that he felt in the soles of his feet, and then it grew, climbing in pitch and volume until it became a full-throated, deafening wail. It was the plant's emergency meltdown siren. The sound was designed to be heard for miles, a terrifying, world-ending scream that signaled catastrophic failure. Frank's heart leaped into his throat. His training took over. He grabbed the emergency phone, a direct line to the county's emergency management office. "This is Black River Station," he shouted over the noise. "We have a siren activation. I repeat, siren activation." The dispatcher's voice was filled with confusion and panic. "Frank, that's impossible. The plant is offline. The system is dead." "I'm telling you, I hear it," Frank yelled. "It's blowing right now." The siren wailed for a full, agonizing minute, its cry echoing off the silent machinery and rolling across the dark landscape. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that rushed back in was deafening, leaving a ringing in Frank's ears and a cold dread in his soul. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the siren system was completely disconnected. The control board in the main command center was dark, its wires cut, its components stripped for scrap. The power grid that fed the plant had been physically severed from the outside world. There was no electricity, no backup generator, nothing that could have powered that siren. Over the next hour, his phone rang off the hook. Calls from the sheriff, from the fire department, from panicked residents in the nearby town who had also heard the impossible alarm. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. Frank had no answers. The next day, a team of engineers arrived, their faces a mixture of skepticism and concern. Frank led them to the control room. It was a ghost of its former self, a dark, dusty space filled with dead consoles. The engineers confirmed what Frank already knew. The system was inert. There was no way it could have been activated. They went to the sirens themselves, massive horns mounted on the roof of the main turbine hall. They were old, rusted, and disconnected. The heavy armored cable that had once supplied their power lay on the roof, severed and coiled like a dead snake. One of the engineers, a man with 30 years of experience at the plant, shook his head in disbelief. "I designed this system," he said, his voice hushed. "It needs a massive amount of power to run. A dedicated substation. There is no physical way for this to have happened." He offered a half-hearted theory about old capacitors holding a residual charge, but he himself admitted that it couldn't possibly be enough to power the sirens for a full minute at that decibel level. The decibel reading, taken from a sound monitor in the nearby town, matched the original system specs perfectly. Whatever had happened, it had been at full power. The siren activation became a local mystery, a ghost story told in the town's diners and bars, The official explanation was a mass auditory hallucination caused by atmospheric conditions, a theory that was roundly mocked by the hundreds of people who had been jolted awake by the whale. But for Frank, who had been at ground zero, it was something more. He felt that the plant itself, the massive, complex entity of steel and concrete, had let out a final, dying breath. A week later, it happened again. The same time, just after midnight, the same soul-shaking, impossible wail that tore through the night's silence. Frank sat in his shack, not with panic this time, but with a strange, chilling sense of awe. He felt like he was listening to the dream of a dead machine, a memory of its own awesome, terrible power. After the second incident, the company decided to take drastic action. They could not have a phantom alarm periodically terrifying the local population. A crew was sent in with cutting torches and cranes. They physically dismantled the sirens, cutting the massive horns from their mounts and lowering them to the ground, where they were cut into smaller pieces for scrap. The throat of the power station was permanently silenced. The activation stopped. But Frank's experience in the silent plant changed. He started to notice other things. A flicker of lights in the dead control room. The faint, metallic clang of a catwalk high above him in the turbine hall when there was no one there. The feeling, constant and oppressive, of being watched by the vast, silent machinery. He came to believe that the plant wasn't dead, but dormant. He believed it had a kind of consciousness, a spirit born of the immense power it had once commanded. The sirens, he thought, were not a malfunction. They were a protest, a roar of defiance from a sleeping giant that was being slowly dismembered. It was the machine's way of reminding the world that it had once been a titan, that it had held the power of life and death, and that even in its demise, it would not go quietly into the dark. The church recordings. In 1978, Sarah Jenkins was a graduate student in ethnomusicology, a field that sent her into the forgotten corners of Appalachia in search of old songs and vanishing traditions. Her project was to record and archive the unique, unadorned hymnals sung in the small, isolated churches of eastern Tennessee. Armed with a state-of-the-art, reel-to-reel tape recorder, she found herself at the old Chestnut Grove Chapel, a simple, whitewashed building that had served its small congregation since the Civil War. The university's ethnomusicology archive still holds the tapes she made there, labeled simply Chestnut Grove, Unexplained Auditory Phenomena. The pastor of the church, an elderly, kind-faced man, gave Sarah his permission to record the Sunday service. The singing was beautiful, a raw, powerful sound that filled the small, sunlit room. The recording was a success, but Sarah was also interested in the church's acoustics, in the way sound moved and lived in the old wooden space. She asked the pastor if she could leave her recorder running in the empty church for a few hours to capture the room tone, the natural ambient sound of the building. He agreed, locking the church behind her as she left for lunch, leaving the tape machine on a pew, its two small microphones pointed toward the altar. When she returned and played back the tape, she expected to hear nothing but the creak of old wood and the distant sound of the wind. Instead, she heard singing. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was a hymn she didn't recognize, sung by what sounded like a small choir of women and children. The voices were ethereal, filled with a strange, melancholic beauty. Her first thought was that the recorder had picked up a radio signal. Sensitive tape recorders were known to sometimes capture bleed from nearby AM stations. She checked her equipment, but everything was properly shielded. She tried again the next day, this time placing the recorder in a different spot. Again, she left the church locked and empty. And again, when she played back the tape, she heard singing. It was a different hymn this time, a mournful, dirge-like tune. The voices were clear, their harmonies strange and archaic. Some of the words sung in a dialect she couldn't place. A cold knot of unease began to form in her stomach. She was a scientist of sound, a rational, objective observer, but what she was hearing was impossible. The church was empty. The doors and windows were locked. There was no source for the music. She took the tapes back to the university's audio lab. She and her professor spent a week analyzing them. They ran the recordings through a spectrogram, a device that creates a visual representation of sound. The spectrograms confirmed what her ears had told her. There were distinct human voices on the tape. The analysis showed the pitch and timbre of multiple singers. It was not radio interference, which would have a different, flatter acoustic signature. The sounds on the tape had the natural reverberation of the church itself. They had originated inside the room. Her professor, a man who had spent his life demystifying sound, had no explanation. He could only stare at the strange, ghostly patterns on the screen and shake his head. Sarah became obsessed. She delved into the history of the Chestnut Grove Chapel. She found that the church had been used as a makeshift hospital during a brutal Civil War battle that had taken place in the surrounding fields. Many soldiers had died on its rough wooden pews. Later, in the early 1900s, a diphtheria outbreak had devastated the local community, and the church had served as a place of quarantine, its small congregation huddling together in sickness and prayer. The place was saturated with a history of sorrow and faith. Sarah returned to the church one last time, a feeling of dread and reverence warring within her. She set up her recorder and, instead of leaving, she sat in the back pew, alone in the silent, empty building. She didn't turn the recorder on. She just sat and listened. For a long time, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the afternoon. But as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shafts of light through the old, wavy glass of the windows, she began to hear it. It wasn't with her ears. It was a feeling, a vibration in the air, the ghost of a sound. It was the faint, impossibly sad echo of a hymn, a song of loss and hope sung by voices that were no longer there. She realized that the tape recorder, with its sensitive microphones, was able to pick up what the human ear could not. It was capturing a residual energy, a memory of sound that had been sung with such emotion, such desperation, that it had been permanently absorbed by the very walls of the church. The singing was a psychic stain, an echo of the past replaying itself in the silence. She packed up her equipment and left, not bothering to make another recording. She had her answer, an answer that science could not provide. The tapes she made at Chestnut Grove Chapel became a strange, unclassifiable artifact in the university archive, a footnote in a forgotten academic paper. Sarah Jenkins went on to have a long, successful career, but she never again tried to capture the sound of an empty room. She had learned that some places are not empty at all. They are filled with the echoes of every prayer, every tear, and every song ever offered up within their walls. And sometimes, if you have a machine sensitive enough to listen, you can still hear them singing. The Appalachian signal box. For a railroad engineer like Tom Callahan, the signals were the silent, guiding language of the rails. Green meant clear track. Yellow meant proceed with caution. Red meant stop, a command as absolute as the laws of physics. His life, and the lives of his passengers, depended on the unwavering reliability of that system. So when a signal box on a lonely stretch of track in the mountains of Pennsylvania started sending impossible messages, it was more than a malfunction. It was a violation of a sacred trust. The Norfolk Southern Maintenance Report from 2014 is a dry, technical document. It speaks of intermittent track occupancy, faults at signal box 734, and concludes that the issue was resolved by replacing a faulty relay. But Tom, who was driving the mainline express that year, knew the truth was far more complex and chilling. The problem started on a rainy Tuesday in the fall. Tom was piloting his train through a deep, wooded valley, the tracks clinging to the side of a mountain. Up ahead, signal 734, which should have been green, was a glaring, solid red. He did what he was trained to do. He hit the brakes, the massive train groaning and screeching as it slowed to a halt just before the signal. He radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, this is 501. I've got a red at 734. Is there traffic ahead?" The dispatcher's voice came back, laced with confusion. "Negative 501. The board is green for you. That stretch is clear all the way to the river." This was a ghost occupancy, a situation where the track's electronic sensors believed a train was present when it was not. It was a known issue, usually caused by moisture in the relay boxes, or a buildup of rust on the rails, creating a false circuit. It was an annoyance, but a common one. Dispatch gave him permission to proceed at a restricted speed, and he rolled his train slowly past the red signal, his eyes scanning the empty track ahead. A maintenance crew was sent out. They opened signal box 734, a small gray metal cabinet by the side of the tracks, and found what they expected: some moisture in the main relay. They dried it out, sealed it up, and cleared the signal. The problem, they thought, was solved. But a week later, Tom got the same red light at the same signal. Again, dispatch confirmed the track was empty. Again, a crew was sent out. This time, they replaced the entire relay, installing a brand new top-of-the-line unit. The ghost, they were sure, had been exorcised, but the ghost was persistent. The signal at 734 continued to turn red, always at random times, always for no reason. It became a known issue on the line, a source of delays and frustration. Tom started to feel a personal connection to the faulty signal, a strange sense of unease every time he approached that stretch of track. He noticed a pattern that the maintenance logs didn't show. The phantom signal seemed to happen most often in the late afternoon, when the sun was low and the shadows in the valley were long and deep. One day, while waiting for clearance to pass the red light, he found himself staring at the woods just beyond the signal box. The area had been the site of a horrific derailment in the 1960s, a passenger train that had lost its brakes on the grade and jumped the tracks, plunging down the embankment. Many people had died. The story was a grim legend among the older engineers. Tom wondered if there was a connection. He began to feel that the signal wasn't malfunctioning. It was trying to tell him something. The red light felt less like a glitch and more like a warning. He mentioned this to an older engineer, a man nearing retirement. The old man nodded slowly, his face grim. "That's the ghost of the '68 wreck," he said, his voice low. "They say the engineer of that train, a fella named Jack, saw something on the tracks that made him hit the brakes too hard. A little girl, standing right where that signal box is now. Of course, there was no girl. He lost control, and the rest is history. They say he's still trying to warn people, still trying to stop the train." Tom, a man of logic and mechanics, wanted to dismiss it as a fanciful story, but the feeling persisted. The red light at signal 734 felt different from other malfunctions. It felt sentient. The breaking point came on a foggy evening in November. Tom was running behind schedule, pushing the train a little faster than usual. As he rounded the curve before signal 734, he saw it. The signal was red, but this time, standing on the tracks directly in front of it, was the figure of a small girl in a white dress. She was just standing there, her back to him, staring down the track into the fog. Tom's blood ran cold. He slammed on the emergency brakes, the train screaming in protest, the cars lurching violently. He laid on the horn, a deafening blast that echoed through the valley. The girl didn't move. The train was going to hit her. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. The train shuddered to a halt, the front of the locomotive just feet from the signal box. Tom opened his eyes, his heart hammering in his chest. The track was empty. The girl was gone. He sat in his cab, shaking, trying to process what he had seen. Was it a real child who had run off? Or was it the ghost from the old engineer's story? Dispatch was screaming in his ear, demanding to know why he had made an emergency stop. He couldn't tell them the truth. He mumbled something about a deer on the tracks. He was given clearance and proceeded slowly, his nerve completely shattered. The maintenance report from that incident notes the emergency stop and the engineer's report of wildlife on the track. It also contains a final, curious note about signal box 734. The ghost occupancy signals stopped that day. The signal never showed a false red again. The new relay, it seemed, had finally fixed the problem. But Tom Callahan knows the truth. He believes that on that foggy evening, he finally saw what the ghost of the 1968 derailment had been trying to warn him about. He believes the persistent red light was not a malfunction, but a message, a desperate attempt by a long-dead engineer to prevent another tragedy. And he believes that his own frantic emergency stop, his response to the phantom girl on the tracks, had finally, after almost 50 years, satisfied the restless spirit. The warning had finally been heeded. The ghost of signal box 734 was at peace.